So, as I said, Bonjour, Criros Indigenicas. Hello, my name is Cree Rose, and I'm the Program Manager for Community Engagement at Native Governance Center. I'm zooming in today from Casa Grande, Arizona, which is the traditional homelands of the O'odham and Peepash peoples. And on behalf of NGC, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Native Governance Center is a Native-led nonprofit dedicated to strengthening the governance systems of Native nations and helping them, helping them exercise their capacity for sovereignty as well. We encourage you to learn more about our programming after today by checking out our website, which is nativegov.org, or by following us on social media at nativegov. Today's virtual event, Understanding and Using Treaty Rights, is going to explore more about treaty rights, how they're being used, and really how they can be supported by anyone. We're going to learn from a panel of leaders currently working in community, and this is such a huge topic that we're excited to just kind of dive in and learn more from different individuals and their experiences. And through their insights, we really hope to deepen our understanding of treaty rights and their importance today. This is really a time for learning, reflection, and ultimately, hopefully, action as well. By coming together, we can advocate for the recognition and enforcement of treaty rights, supporting the sovereignty and self-determination of Native nations. And so before we get into our content today, we do want to share just a few quick housekeeping items. The first of which is that I'd like to remind everyone attending on Zoom to submit any questions they have using the Q&A box on their screen. And if you're tuning in via Facebook, you can go ahead and use that comments section. This event is being closed captioned, so if you would like those on, you can turn those on by using the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And finally, we do want to give a shout out to today's event sponsors. We want to thank our full series event sponsors, starting with Minnetonka, a fourth generation Minnesota family footwear company that is committed to reconciliation work that both honors and invests in the Native American community. We also want to thank the University of St. Thomas and their Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. St. Thomas educates students to be morally responsible leaders who think critically, act wisely, and work skillfully to advance the common good. We also want to thank Travoy. They are a certified B Corporation that is helping bring over $1.9 billion in housing and economic development to Native communities since 1955. And finally, we'd like to extend gratitude to the Conservation Corps for their support of this event. They are a nonprofit organization and AmeriCorps grantee where the Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa engage with hundreds of youth and young adults each year in programs and initiatives that support access to outdoor recreation, restore natural habitat, protect waterways, and respond to community needs and natural disasters. We are going to start today's event with a short presentation on treaty rights basics, and then we're going to follow it up with our panel discussion. So let me bring up that basic slideshow here, just a moment. And we want to provide some context for today's event and just really make sure that we all have a good understanding of what a treaty is and how they work within the context of the United States. So first, we're going to cover that question, what is a treaty? And so a treaty is an agreement between two sovereign powers. Treaties are legally binding documents between sovereign nations that establish those nations' political and property relations. And Article 6 of the United States Constitution holds that treaties are, quote, the supreme law of the land. And this infers that when a treaty is signed, it's a legal document that cannot be broken. Treaties between Native nations and the United States confirm each nation's rights and privileges, and these treaties have the same force today as when they were originally signed. Like the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, these treaties do not expire with time. And so the United States mainly used treaties as a means to take land from Native nations while legitimizing themselves as a country. These treaties, over 300 of which have actually been ratified across the country, are as diverse as the Native nations themselves that entered into those agreements. The presence or absence of treaties with a Native nation was really influenced by a few different things, but that includes historical timing, geographic location, shifting policies of the US government, diplomatic and political dynamics between Native nations and the US government, and so much more. So not all tribes have treaties, and this has led to varying levels of legal recognition by the US government and further challenges inherent sovereignty of Native nations. Even if a Native nation did successfully negotiate a treaty with the US government, some of those treaties were never ratified by the Senate, and others were broken, violated, or ignored, failing to be fully honored. So for those Native nations that were negotiated and ratified their treaties, those treaties included some specific provisions that addressed land, resources, healthcare, and so much more. So today, these treaties continue to affirm inherent sovereignty of Native nation, and they safeguard rights of their citizens. So different treaties are going to have different provisions, but they may include a permanent land base for citizens, commonly known now as a reservation. It might include healthcare, education, sovereignty and self-governance, cultural and religious freedom, and the confirmation and protection of certain rights, which I know some of our panelists are going to talk about later. So that might include fishing and hunting rights, jurisdiction over land, and many other provisions there. And so treaty rights of Native nations and citizens have been kind of challenged and affirmed throughout the history of the United States. These challenges and affirmations really often reflect a broader struggle over land, power, and resources. So we want to share some examples of how treaties have been challenged in the past. One big way that treaties are challenged or often violated is through land seizures or broken promises. And unfortunately, this is an example that many of us might be familiar with. And an example from the Service Region of Native Governance Center would be the Treaty of Fort Laramie and the Black Hills. So the United States violated the Treaty of Fort Laramie by seizing the Black Hills, which are sacred to the Lakota Sioux, after gold had been discovered there. And this is something that happened back in the 19th century, but is still ongoing. There's also the challenge of termination policies. The government actually had the Termination Act, which was very active in the 50s and 60s, that terminated the status of tribes, which led to their treaties no longer being honored by the US government. There's also resource exploitation and environmental degradation. One example that happened along the Pacific Northwest was the fish wars, which again was in the 60s and throughout the 70s. But this was where Native nations and citizens were having to fight to use their treaty rights to fish and hunt. And then we're also seeing challenges in the form of infrastructure projects and land use. Another very common example that many folks know about from NGC's service region would be DAPL. So we're seeing the construction of pipelines and other infrastructure threatens our communities. And on the flip side of that, while treaties have frequently been challenged, they have also been successfully defended and affirmed. And that has happened through legal action, policy changes, and grassroots advocacy, which really just reminds us of the importance of our own communities. So we want to share some different examples of that as well. One thing happening more and more is Supreme Court decisions that affirm treaty rights. So as recently as 2020, one example is McGirt v. Oklahoma. And this is where the US Supreme Court actually reaffirmed the Muskogee Creek Nation's treaty rights and ruled that almost half of the state is actually considered Indian country. So this decision has had major implications for tribal sovereignty, but also jurisdiction. And then we're also seeing affirmation in the form of federal legislation that supports treaty rights. A general example of that passed in the 1970s, but that was recently challenged, is the Indian Child Welfare Act. We're also seeing more recognition of land rights and sacred sites. I love seeing this more and more in the form of land back for different Native nations and communities. And then we're seeing the affirmation of cultural rights and religious freedoms. So an example of that I think is important to share is the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, which was only passed in 1978, but that law aims to protect and preserve spiritual and religious practices for Native nations and citizens. And so we know that this is just a huge topic. There's no way we can cover it all in an hour. So we really encourage everyone after today to learn more about treaty rights, learn more about sovereignty and the Native nations nearest to you. Or if you're a citizen of a Native nation, get more involved in your treaty rights. Learn more about them, how you can use and exercise those rights today. And we really encourage everyone to explore a treaty library as well. I'm going to drop a link for that in the chat so folks can check it out if they're curious. But this will tell you more about treaties overall, and you can look up some ones near you. And that is really it for our basics information. Now it is my great honor to introduce today's panel, which includes Candice, Marne, and Chanda. And so I want to welcome our panelists and turn it over to them. So our panelists will come on screen here momentarily, but we are going to just kind of start off today's session by having them introduce themselves. And I have an opening question for them. We don't have to go in any certain order, but my opening question for our panelists is if you could just introduce yourself, tell us a little bit more about who you are and what makes you passionate about treaty rights. And I see everyone popping on screen, but Marne, if you want to go ahead.
Oh, sure. Bonjour. My name is Marne Kaeske. I am the Cultural Preservation Specialist for the 1854 Treaty Authority. We're an intertribal natural resource management agency working for the Bois Forte Band of Chippewa and the Grand Portage Band of Lake Superior Chippewa in implementing and protecting off-reservation treaty harvest. So I think that my jam happens to be the assertion of sovereignty through treaty implementation and the care of our natural resources or relatives that we share the landscape with. As Western worldview regards natural resources as one of sport or recreation or extraction, whereas these systems are a means to an end and really unsustainable.
Thank you so much. And we can have our next panelist jump right in.
I can go ahead and go next, Cree. So my name is Candice Jimenez. I'm a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs here in Oregon. And I serve at the Northwest Portland Area Indian Health Board, which also includes our Northwest Tribal Epidemiology Center. We serve the 43 tribes in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And I think that's really part of why I carry a lot of passion in this space, is to make sure that the treaty rights that are upheld via healthcare access, the resources that come through from federal government, federal agencies, from the National Institutes of Health, CDC, SAMHSA, all the different health and human service agencies are in alignment with making sure that the provision of healthcare and everything that goes with that in conjunction and really in tandem with the urban native experience as well. When we talk about funding that goes out directly to tribes, also we need to be speaking to the amount of our community members and population who are in urban settings as well, and how they're accessing healthcare and how funding is meeting them there as well in an equitable manner. So that's where I come into this space and really want to see the uplifting of our healthcare and our health in general for our people upheld through our treaty rights. Thank you, Cree.
Buju Chanda Indigenous Ante Goneashik and Dojibwe Winnakas Moose and Dudam Gakiji Winang and Dunjaba. Hi, my name is Chanda. I am working at the 1854 Treaty Authority under Marne. I'm one of her education outreach aides here. I'm also a member of the Anishinaabe or Gakiji Winang Anishinaabe First Nation, formerly known as the Lac LaCroix First Nation in Ontario, Canada. And I guess what makes me passionate about treaty rights is I have a lot of experience with my grandparents and my aunties and uncles going out harvesting here in Minnesota, but also where I'm from, up in Lac LaCroix. And I guess I'm also a student at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and going to college and learning about how these rights have been threatened has really made me more passionate and want to advocate for them more once I graduate and get into the field, I guess.
Beautiful. Thank you all for sharing. And I think some of you kind of touched on this next question already, so it's okay if you want to go back and expand on anything or bring up anything new. But I think many folks kind of view treaties as these documents of the past. And so how have you seen the assertion of treaty rights impact community members today? Whether that is what you're currently involved in through your job or personally.
I can maybe get us started. I think there's a few different ways I see this happening in the realm of healthcare. We often when we're working, we're serving our tribal leaders throughout the Northwest, from the 43 federally recognized tribes in Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. And one of the things that we always come across, especially as new tribal leaders are coming into the space, or you have tribal leaders or tribal health directors, behavioral health directors, the whole scope of how folks are interacting with healthcare, is that there's often a discourse around how do we interact to impact healthcare advocacy, legislation, really revenue, right? How is that revenue being translated to come into tribes and to tribal health programs or clinics or urban Indian settings like Native American Rehabilitation Association, for example, here in Portland. Really looking at the way that we voice through policy advocacy, both through state and federal avenues of advocacy. When we're thinking about, especially right now, I think the climate of Congress and what we've seen the last few years, especially with the COVID pandemic, is seeing the way in which congressional I guess discourse around funding and continuing resolutions and all of the sort of like instability that creates, and how does that look when it comes to like funding that comes through, say, like the Indian Health Service through IHS, and what does that mean when we're talking about all the different lingo that Congress use about like mandatory funding or advanced appropriations, programs that are really vital to Indian health programs, like the Special Diabetes Program for Indians, for example, or the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, and what it means for those to be reauthorized or continually continually taken forward, but not in a permanent manner. I think that's part of I think kind of answering your question, Cree. There's a lot of nuance to it, and it can be really hard to understand, especially for tribal leaders as they're coming into these spaces that they might not kind of have the like we often talk about, like, you know, walking in these two worlds or walking in these different worlds of advocacy when it comes to stepping outside of tribal community spaces and then interacting, say, if tribal leaders are going to Washington, D.C. for Hill visits, how are they taking what they know matters in community and translating that to funding or regulatory changes that will be supportive and helpful for tribal health programs. So just kind of a little bit of touching base there. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think that connection is definitely there with the 1854 Treaty Authority as well. And I'm hoping Marne and Chanda can speak more to kind of what they provide internally for citizens and how that relates to treaty rights, but also how, similar to Candice, they're advocating for this outside of community and really pushing for those government to government relations.
Absolutely. I think Candice did a really good job of breaking that down. And conversely, or mirrored in the natural resource management world, it really holds the federal government in the responsibility of the trust responsibility that they have, which was outlined in treaty agreements, and it keeps them in the present space. So, for example, under the 1978 Self-Determination and Education Act, the establishment of the 638 contractors, which are the rights protection implementation contract holders, that goes to fund intertribal natural resource management agencies such as the 1854 Treaty Authority. There are 3 of which reside in the Western Great Lakes area and 2 in the Pacific Northwest. And on the flip side of that, you know, it's moving towards many federal agencies working together with tribal governments towards co-management in spaces such as national forests and national parks. So eventually it will end up to jobs, you know, just to echo what Candice said.
Yeah, so a lot of what we do here at the 1854 Treaty Authority, at least what I do, is we work with the youth on our reservations up in Boyce Fort or in Grand Portage. And we teach them how to hunt, fish, and gather, how to utilize these treaty rights. And it's to preserve them so they don't go dormant like they did back in like the 1900s, you know, and then there was this big fight to get them back. So a lot of what we do is to pass this knowledge on. And I've seen a lot of the youth nowadays, like when we go out and teach them, they like really enjoyed doing this kind of stuff. And they're always asking me questions about like, how does this fishing, like, did our ancestors fish? How did this work? These canoes, how did they canoe? And we get to teach them about these kind of things. So that's kind of the impact I see a lot, is just with the youth and getting to see their excitement with this kind of stuff.
That's beautiful. And as an auntie, I love to hear that. And I second that. I think our youth are curious, they're ready for this knowledge, and they're like just ready to move things forward in the most beautiful ways. And so I think you touched on it already, but I'm curious, just in everybody's experience, how does being able to understand and use your treaty rights support cultural preservation and support that cultural knowledge in communities?
I could touch on that a little bit more. So like I talked about in the last question, utilizing these treaty rights is directly connected to preserving the cultural heritage. For example, teaching people, these kids, how to go wild ricing. We teach them to use, like, for example, cedar knocking sticks. They're really light, they won't damage the plant. And when you teach them that, you're teaching them to respect the plant. And you're teaching them to view it like another person, I guess, like treat it with the same respect as you would another person. Another thing we do when we go wild ricing is we only knock the plant once. So then the extra rice that falls will help to reseed the plant. And it's kind of teaching them this traditional teaching of reciprocity and respecting the land around us. So in my opinion, treaty rights and cultural preservation and all that, it's directly interconnected. You can't really separate that.
Absolutely, Chanda. I think it really reinforces values, right? It moves the idea of take or resource acquisition away from anything associated with monetary values and becomes a means of community care, taking care of community through feeding your family and sharing meals and things.
Yeah, and I think to add on to what you both shared too, within the healthcare space, there's so many different ways that I've seen this happening, and I think we've all seen this like in our own communities, and maybe even the ways we're accessing healthcare, behavioral health, mental health, dental, all those different areas that really contribute to how we take care of ourselves and how we also have that community of care for others in our communities. I think of this often, specifically like here in Oregon State, is that the Oregon Health Authority, for example, that is responsible for provision of care for like the Medicaid clients in the state, and how, for example, for many years now, they have funded equine therapy, for example, within scope of healthcare, behavioral health, prevention, right? All these different spaces where folks might be maybe in their recovery journey, for example. There's so much to say about cultural responsiveness and how that really is the way that coming back, right, where we may have maybe our journey has taken us away, or maybe we're learning or even relearning, or learning for the first time about our own ways of knowing in culturally responsive healthcare settings. Often those are within tribal healthcare settings, but also they've been supported too by other, dominant healthcare systems that are starting to learn what our community's needs are. And an example that's happening right now, potentially in Oregon State, is that every 5 years, for example, in Medicaid, so every state, right, is responsible for their Medicaid. So here in Oregon, it's called the Oregon Health Plan. So for every 5 years, there's this opportunity to apply for something called a 1115 waiver. And so what this is kind of like these special demonstration projects that can be used. So right now, Oregon has what's called health-related social needs, which is kind of another way of saying like social determinants of health, and sort of like climate-related response that include like getting air conditioners out to folks, or getting air purifiers out, or getting generators out for folks who might need access to, being able to power oxygen machines, for example. But also in the same 5-year plan, Oregon has also applied with the support of the Tribal Affairs Division within the Oregon Health Authority to have what's called tribal-based practices, and that is what Oregon has been doing for a long time. That includes equine therapy, and so that is those beautiful parts of our communities that do support our well-being, like sweat, or being able to have a healer from your community who maybe like they haven't gone to like medical school, or they're not a nurse, they're not a community health worker, but we know those people are in our community, right? Those natural healers, and being able to have reimbursement practices for them to also be able to provide the care that we need responsive to our own community from community. So it's just another way too, I think, that we're able to help preserve our ways and our knowledge passing right within the scope of healthcare.
Those are some wonderful examples. Thank you. And I think it's very heartening to hear just more about the work being done within systems in terms of setting up new policy and creating change, but also just those changes we see happening in our own communities of youth wanting to learn more about their treaty rights and really getting involved. So I think it's just such a cool mix of what communities and citizens are doing that are bringing about these awesome changes for everyone. And folks have kind of touched on it already, but I'm curious, in that more systems or management set, how are treaty rights impacting the management, or how we are really setting things up in these different systems, from like healthcare to education to natural resources?
Chanda, you had a really good idea about this one. Go ahead.
Okay, so there's often this idea when we're talking about natural resources and Native people and treaty rights that Native people are taking more than they need, or somehow destroying the land by utilizing their treaty rights and going out there and just like absolutely taking everything. But as many of us know, all of us, I hope, this narrative is completely false. It's not just a free-for-all for these resources, as many people still believe today. For example, our people, the Bois Forte and Grand Portage, our constituents, they actually have 3 different conservation codes they have to follow. And I learned this from a community member when we were doing firearm safety last week. And he brought this up, and it really it made me think about this a lot. So when they're not on the reservation or in our ceded territory, they have to follow the Minnesota State Conservation Code. When they're in our ceded territory, they have to follow and know the 1854 ceded code. And if they're on the reservation, they have to know their reservation code. So in reality, it's not that they're just going out there and doing whatever they want. They have these systems they have to follow, and they do it because they care about the land. Yeah, that's all I had to say about that.
Absolutely. And another thing that we're moving towards in our understanding and philosophy of natural resource management is, again, community wellness, but through food sovereignty. It allows for the resilience of communities with the awareness of and access to diverse food systems, alternatives, and it essentially is self-determination through an unknown future. Right now we're in the middle of a wild ride, climate change. We don't know what it's going to bring, but we have to be able to pull ourselves up with our bootstraps. And so I think that's that's all I have.
Yeah. And I think what I would just add too, and I think this is really just like supplementary to what you all just shared, is going back to what you had said earlier about the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act with ISDEA and 638 contracts, that I think we're just in this point right now, especially in the healthcare realm, where there's a lot of like really just dialing in as far as what we know and what we should be receiving as far as our healthcare, and what it's not just about like deserving it. It's more than that. It's really about I always think about it as like prevention, and how do we really think about making sure to like going to the youth, like starting really early, getting folks connected intergenerationally between tribal leaders and the next generation of tribal leaders when it comes to understanding these various areas: natural resources, fish and wildlife, hunting and fishing rights, healthcare, all those different items that are specifically in treaty, right? And so looking at all of these like cornerstones of legal authority, Cree, you mentioned the McGirt case, and all of those, and really like connecting what does that mean for either supporting or not supporting, or maybe veering away by the federal government to sort of like chip away, or that we need to like really dial into making sure that we're really from a young age treating what we share at home and what we share and what our children and youth have access to in educational systems, and to also like push on those education systems from the time our little ones are entering educational spaces, whether that's our own if we're homeschooling, or in public or private school systems, charter schools. We also have that kind of responsibility to make sure that the youth that are coming up are aware of these different systems. And I think sometimes it can be challenging, especially for healthcare, because oftentimes we just go when, like maybe it's an emergency, or maybe something is really painful, or we're not having kind of like normal touches with the healthcare system, whether that's on or off our reservation, and what that means to have like culture responsive care. So yeah, there's like so many little touch points, like, how are we increasing the amount of American Indian, Alaska Native community members going into healthcare to be our providers, to be our community health workers, to be our traditional health workers in community as well. And what does that mean for the future of how our care is provided in community? So kind of thinking like future generation wise as well into the youth.
That's perfect. And I think our kind of thought process behind offering an event series on treaty rights was kind of acknowledging that non-natives maybe don't have a good understanding of treaty rights because it's not necessarily talked about a lot within our public education systems. And then even as Native citizens, we might have different understandings of our own treaty rights based on where we live, what we have access to, and to Candice's point, that foundational information that's starting at home. So like, what are we teaching our young ones about their responsibilities, about their rights? And that really moves me into our next question, which I was really excited about, is what is everyone's vision for the future of sovereignty and treaty rights? And how can we get our youth involved in that? I know a lot of this work starts at home and starts in our own communities. So what can we be doing, excuse me, to really prepare our youth to be part of that future vision or part of that future movement?
For me, in the future, I'd like to see more of like the general public, I guess, come to an understanding of treaty rights and sovereignty. Like you said, there's that disconnect between people. And especially, I notice when I'm even just out and about and I tell people, oh, I work for the 1854 Treaty Authority, and then they're like, what's that? It's a treaty. Tell me about this. And then it turns into this whole conversation of me having to like basically give them like a college lecture about everything. So in the future, I'd like to see more of a general understanding of these things. And like Candice said, teaching your children, teaching the youth about this and starting early, letting them know what their rights are, and teaching them how to use them is really important. But that's my general vision.
That's perfect, Chanda. A lot of times when addressing treaty rights with the public, with the general public, with non-tribal audiences, you need to describe and really interpret down the fact that reserved rights and what is held within those treaty agreements are reserved from a way of life in the past. they exist presently and they will into the future. So what that looks like sometimes is really working with our state, federal, county counterparts in maintaining access to areas and um, access to areas as well as habitat to support fish and wildlife.
Yeah, and just to add from this perspective, as far as like understanding from for youth for healthcare is there's a couple examples that we have like within the health board space here in Portland is that we have our basically the leaders of our health board are the 43 tribes throughout Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and there's primary and alternate delegates. We also have a tribal youth delegate program that is a representation of youth from the Northwest tribes who help lead the work of the health board, and it really gives them a early onset connection to the tribal leaders, not only from their communities, but from other communities, and understanding that there's a whole different landscape of how that's approached, right? Just like each of our communities is different. Also, the kind of the healthcare access and what it means to like going back to like 638 programs, contracting and compacting, and like how that's so different for each tribal community as well as how the programs are managed. I think it's just getting youth from a young age to have that exposure, and also to just explain like like what is public health, because I didn't really learn about like what is public health until like maybe the end of college, and then really started to kind of understand like, oh, like public health was like it's all around us, right? It's just ingrained in everything and how we're thinking about how are we having a community of care, which is really inherent to our tribal communities, and really throughout the world with Indigenous community in general, is that we all are looking out for each other, and we are looking at ways to start from that young age of how we're bringing in and supporting one another, especially intergenerationally. So one of the examples that we sort of give to is like an icebreaker sometimes when we're working with youth and helping them to understand like what is public health, how do you navigate like tribal healthcare advocacy, whether that's in your state or at the federal level, or you know even local, you too, like in your own tribal community, is like what would you do to like change or modify like a tribal or local law or regulation or rule, even like getting as simple as like how would you go about changing a rule at home? Maybe there's a rule that maybe your family has implemented, but you might see that there's a shift to that. So like how do you advocate? Like how do you share your voice? And so just looking at it in real simple ways to start younger, and even and then kind of like going further along as there's understanding is engaged, is like how do we live and navigate like our traditions in a modern world, and what does that look like, and what are we doing to make those shifts and also be flexible, taking healthy risks to improve something in our community, and translating that to like, hey, like that's part of public health, and that's also part of the changes that we want to see in creating a system of healthcare that is from your vision, like as youth, because we know, right, that the in the healthcare systems and a lot of the dominant systems, that those weren't created by us. And so what can we do to create that new way? It's maybe not even a system, maybe it's something totally different. There's a time for change to make it responsive to our communities and really have that be led by future generations. So yeah, just kind of going back to the early exposure and just having those conversations from a young age.
Miigwech, thank you all. And I just want to really reiterate that of like build up these spaces and roles for youth whenever possible. I think there is so much that we can learn from the youth, but also so much that they are ready to learn and do themselves. And so I really love hearing about examples like the youth councils and youth advisories. I think those are just really wonderful ways to engage our youth throughout these processes and systems. And alongside that, I think I would really encourage folks to be curious, because as we've shared, all of these things are very interconnected. So if you're really passionate about passionate about treaty rights, maybe you'll consider a role in healthcare. Maybe it will be in natural resources, maybe it will be in law. All of those areas have a direct impact and a connection. And so I think before we move into the Q&A, just a quick question for our panelists is, after today, how would you recommend folks kind of get involved, or what can they do to better understand and support treaty rights after this session? We typically have audiences that are Native and non-Native. So yeah, any suggestions they can carry forward after today?
I think it starts with understanding the history of the land in which you call home. Again, to Indigenous folks as well as non-tribal, and understanding like when and how did your place, your home, become United States territory. Specifically for tribal audiences, I think too, it's important that we create a space to sit down and read the 1854 treaty together. And in fact, we did that last week. Chanda led a session in one of our firearm safety trainings, that they sat together as a group and read the 1854 treaty in all of its nuances and discussed it.
Yeah, I agree with Marnie. Just like understanding the land that you call home, understanding that history. Just general education is the most important way to achieve that understanding. I know a lot of people they can absorb more information by going out and doing like personal research in that way. Another thing that I've noticed is like if you have the ability, take like an American Indian Studies class. That's how a lot of people I know, a lot of my peers have come to understand this kind of thing. That's all I've got to say on that.
Yeah, I think Marnie and Chanda said it well. I I think it's all about like that. When we've presented with youth before, with like our tribal youth delegates, we say it's like the why factor. Like, understand your context. Like, why is it that like the current space is the way it is, right? And so then it comes back to, okay, like understand treaties, read them, understand that, then you can start making those connections, like what is like quote federal trust responsibility? What does that mean to then like connect with your land and your culture and your people and governance and sovereignty, and things start to mold together in a way that you better understand. And a lot of the time too, like when we're sharing with non-native folks and kind of understanding context better too, is really even to look back at like federal Indian policy periods, right? And going back to all of those and really getting to the basics of what does it mean right now to be like in self-determination? What does it mean to have gone through times of our people being moved into like urban settings very purposefully, or into reservation lands, all of those different periods of time that have really contextually brought us into what we know as the current space we're in, and how does that now translate into like what we do and how we advocate, and what does that mean in policy when we're talking about tribes, states, federal entities, and then all of the systems that are a part of that. Then it starts to make sense, but I think at first it can be challenging to see like, oh, how, like what what does all of this mean? But once you start digging into it, just like you said, Marnie and Chanda, like it starts to make sense. And yeah, just add that.
I love that. Thank you all. Because I really loved how you phrased it, understanding your context. That's so important for folks to just kind of sit with and do their own research on, because it's going to be different for each and every one of us based on our identity, where we live, what we do. So it's important for you to stay curious and start digging into that information. And I see we have a couple Q&A questions rolling in, so I think we'll transition over to that now. But our first one in here is, have any of you seen examples of returning land to tribes that spanned more than one treaty boundary, or maybe included more than one native nation? And if so, maybe what was the experience in managing all the various bureaucratic pieces when there's so many different nations impacted? If anybody has ideas there. And if they haven't seen this before, the person has a follow-up question on like, where might it be good to start?
Well, I think I can think of two examples right off the bat. If anyone joining this session didn't have a chance to log in last week, Dr. Robert Miller did a really great job of distilling some of the background of federally named policy as it pertains to treaty rights. And he touched on the McGirt case. He discussed it a lot, and how that is breaking a lot of barriers and also causing a lot of confusion within the existing bureaucratic processes with Indian country. And it's really complex, so I'm going to transition here and discuss on the allotment era, and how when the United States changed its regime for how lands are going to be handed down through tribes and through indigenous families. It created a lot of work for them. When you have shareholders over 50 generations on a parcel of property, it created a lot of work for them. Just to give you a tidbit, yeah, you guys do you wanna add on to that at all?
I don't have much experience with that personally, so my apologies.
Yeah, I don't either. Yeah, the only thing like I would just kind of like maybe to talk about like just that last part. If you haven't seen this before, where do you think is a good place to start? I think Marnie said earlier, like tribal consultation. I think that's also like a valid component to those types of discussions that might be coming up as a part of a I don't know if it's a transaction, because I don't know quite how it works, but just doubling down on that and making sure that that's being co-created from the beginning with everyone involved in the lands there.
Absolutely. Just want to reiterate that tribal consultation portion. And depending on where these Native nations are located, what treaties were signed, they might already have groups that you could approach, or organizations that are doing that kind of work. So I think that goes back to the research piece as well, of just like knowing your context, maybe what's already out there and who to approach. And then we have another question in the chat here. And so this person is a Red Cross disaster mental health volunteer. First of all, thank you for being a volunteer. They say, I value our organization and volunteers honoring our working relationships with American Indian / Alaskan Natives. What would be your recommendations on how we best connect and learn? And I think that's a great one. Doesn't have to be specific to healthcare, but just those looking to connect and learn from Native communities and individuals.
I could get us started there for Rose's question. Yeah, I think the opportunity for dialogue and connecting with local communities, depending on kind of your location. Like if it's a rural setting, like just having the reach out and the access into that community to have opportunities for even like community learning sessions, lunch and learns, just real basic, like just getting to know one another and getting to know the community. And then if you're in an urban setting, I think very similarly, just offering opportunities for culturally responsive learning together, co-learning, because I think there's always a lot to learn back and forth in between communities. And often I just often think back to times like during the pandemic where there was a lot of hesitation, right? Like getting back into community and even like even if we have been in community a lot and then going through the pandemic and then there was this period of just being really mindful of everyone's safety and their health, their needs, and being sensitive to like what's maybe happening in their home and how they're being protective of elders or other community members. I think just asking, like how and what can we learn together, and what can we learn together that maybe we don't know about one another's communities, so that we can be responsive with like the volunteering that's happening, or the way that you're engaging with community members within the Red Cross's response in a disaster, for example, and especially when it comes to mental health. But yeah, that's what I would offer.
Thank you. And I see we're approaching the end of our time, but do our other panelists have anything else to add to that response?
I was just gonna say, reaching out and like building connections with community organizations or with the tribe itself, maybe setting up events, that kind of stuff would probably be the best way I would go about that. We have a lot of, well, here at 1854, we collaborate with a lot of different groups in order to teach them about these things. And a lot of those community organizations are happy to do that. And don't be afraid, I guess, to ask questions is all I'd say.
Absolutely. And I would encourage folks, stay curious, like you attended this event for a reason. So look out for additional learning opportunities. As some of our panelists have said already, look out for those like appropriate opportunities to be in community. So maybe they're holding a public powwow. That's something that you can go get connected to people, maybe start that relationship building, and you're not asking that nation or community to do a whole lot of education for you. So look out for opportunities like that as well. Or I know in the Pacific Northwest, sometimes there were salmon bakes and things with really delicious food that you could go out and eat. So I am all for looking out for those opportunities to really be in and engage with community. And so I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists today. I know that this was a whole lot of information, and I don't think an hour is anywhere near enough. But you all just shared some really wonderful experiences, information, and knowledge. So I'm just so grateful for everything that you all brought into the session today, your good energy, and really just how you are able to engage with each other, coming from kind of different program areas and roles. But just Chimigwech for everything that you're doing out in community. We so appreciate and just see what you're doing. And I love to see how it's going to move forward in the future. I also just want to say thank you to everyone who attended our event live today. Our apologies if you were not able to get your question answered, or if you still had additional questions you wanted to ask. We're going to post a recording of this event on our social media soon. And then we're also going to be working on a written guide, kind of as a combination from both events. We know there's a lot of curiosity both for Native folks and non-Native about understanding and using treaty rights. So we'll be sharing some additional info soon. And as our panelists and others have shared, really just continue your learning after today. Look out for that treaty library, look out for resources and events near you. And please know that you can always follow up with us for questions as well. If you learned something today, consider making a contribution to Native Governance Center, or consider checking out these amazing folks as well. And additionally, we would love to hear from you. So after this event, we're going to email out a survey that everyone can complete. And we also just hope that you'll stay tuned for future events. In September, we're going to be offering a session on dispelling common myths about Indian country, and we're excited to share more info on that soon. But just Shimigwech, and thank you again to everyone for joining. Thank you so much to our panelists for their time today. I will be closing out the event shortly. But again, just thank you so much. We appreciate all you do, and we're looking forward to sharing out this info soon. And I see folks sharing stuff in the chat. Please feel free to copy and paste those if you need. But otherwise, Gigawabaman Manala, thank you so much. We'll see you again soon. I hope that you can attend another NGC event or check out our resources online. And to our panelists, I will follow up with more info, but I hope you have a beautiful day. Thank you all.